The new ban list marks a new era in Yu-Gi-Oh! Once again. The format's ever changing. It's time to once again take a look at the best decks of the current format, put them in a tier list, and rank them against each other to see what the best options are to bring to your next event. As this is coming out the day after YCS Pittsburgh, I'm interested to see how my predictions and perspective of the meta hold up when set up against the empirical observations of the YCS itself. And with that said, it's also good to engage in conversation. So if you have any disagreements about my positioning or reasonings for anything in this tier list, then again, comment section below. Just remember to keep it respectful of to myself and to others. We're all here to learn, to have fun, and to grow. As well as let me know that you want to see more of these tier lists or more frequently. I didn't make one in that last little pocket format, and I don't want to spam my entire channel being just tier lists. But if you guys like it, then maybe we do them a little more frequently. And as well as there's a new feature for US viewers where you can hype up the video, and it does go a long way as well. But with that said, let's actually get into the breakdown. So when talking about a tier list, the first parameter to define is of course going to be what are the tiers, right? Do you have an S tier? Do you have a different sort of categorical definition? So to me, the tier 1 decks have this sort of ability to be driving forces or dominant forces in the metagame. And the decks that do well are either decks that are positioned well into these driving forces, they are these driving forces, or they don't lose to the same non-engine as the driving forces decks. So this means that even if a deck wins OICS and you can increase its place on a tier list at any given point in time, it doesn't reflect the format in itself, how the deck is being respected and how it kind of warps the game around it. So keeping that in mind, I've broken down into 6 different tiers. Now, I would like to add one last caveat to all this. It's important to remember that there's different ways to engage with a Yu-Gi-Oh! And these tier lists are supposed to serve the game in a way that engages with it in a very competitive fashion. And that means I look for every single edge and advantage possible, and that could be the defining factor. So while many decks could sit near the top of Rogue, when it gets to these long, arduous tournaments with the best players who have the best decks, it gets incredibly hard. So just because your favorite deck, like Hero maybe, isn't on here, doesn't mean it's unplayable. It just will struggle to cope at the absolute highest level, which is where this video is positioned.
Look at this. Money. Wow. All these cards I'm never going to touch. All these cards I'm never going to touch, and now I can sell them for more cards I'm never going to touch. I love you, Jesse Kotton.
So with that said, let's talk about the decks. Let's start off with Yummy. So to me, pure Yummy is a tier 1.1 strategy. However, it is not the one deck that I think inches a little further ahead. Yummy excels in the fact that it can have a very strong grind game. It can play well into a large number of hand traps. It does a lot with one card, and depending on the pieces you play, can do quite a bit with that. Even in the pure Yummy deck, we've seen people play cards like Silhouette Rabbits to search the Apophis traps and therefore beat stuff like Dark Ruler No More. The biggest edges to me with this deck are the fact that it feels like there are very few singular cards that outright shut out Yummy. When you're going first with Yummy and your opponent hand traps you, most of the time it really doesn't do much, or if it does, it's very easy for you to extend past it. Where the deck can struggle, however, is your board is weaker. And what that means is, especially if you're not playing cards like Silhouette Rabbit, that breakers and higher engine count decks can be effective against you. And this is what led to the format developments that we saw in the past few months, and how Triff won his YCS in Lima. The other problem that I have with Yummy is that there are many games where your deck will lack the extension to play through disruption. So this means not being able to play through your opponent's field, or even some simple cards like a Draco Tale Horn. Now, this may sound weird because I just said it was good into hand traps. That's because Yummy thrives into negation. It's rather bad into removal on the initial summons. Part of the most powerful things Yummy has going for it is that its link and its synchros are incredible against targeted effects, because it lets you dodge things almost immediately. But if you're not able to develop those points where you get 2 monsters on the field together, then you're just summoning monsters that do very little. And the deck doesn't have an incredible amount of extension, with most of the cards not being able to play themselves from the hand freely. Marshmallow fixes that as being the only one to just summon itself with no pre-existing field. Now, thankfully, the deck doesn't require much, it just requires a Link 1, meaning you can play other engines in the deck, like, in the more simpler terms, the Sky Striker cards, or you can play some of the other engines we'll touch on momentarily. One other edge you get by playing a pure Yummy deck is you get to play Dominus Purge. This isn't a standard across every variant, although many variants of Yummy can play this. And finally, for the position on Yummy, the last kind of thing that I'm paying attention to as I'm looking at Yummy in the format is that it lacks removal, in the sense of when you're playing through a field and you're kind of deciding how to beat your opponent. Something I realized is if the battle phase gets used, and therefore can't get your attack boost with Mignon and all your guys, you don't have many ways of dealing with your opponent's cards. You can maybe make an Azalea or an SP if you have space for Azalea to clean up some bodies, and then Croaky can pop a card. Koki, depending on the position, can pop one card. But for the most part, if you're able to stick bodies, or you have a lot of ways to generate bodies, like say with the Futsu, Yummy kind of struggles to clean up the field state. And that's important because Yummy can also struggle against high attack monsters just attacking over the synchros before they can tag out. These are all things that make the Yummy deck not completely ideal to play as a pure solo deck. Otherwise, it would just be far and away the best deck. But it does have these key problems that open up other variants to succeed. These other variants bring new problems instead, but they do address some of the things that the pure Yummy deck struggle with. So where do the rest of the Yummy variants fall in this list? I'm going to discuss two other main ones, although this doesn't really capture the entire picture of Yummies. The one deck that I feel like holds this domineering position as tier 1 is the most important thing people are kind of preparing for right now, is Mitsurugi Yummy. It's kind of incredible how both these engines have become so splashable, and it's what makes it hard to talk about a tier list as independent decks, because every deck is slightly different iterations of almost the same thing. When Yummy came out, I really wasn't in tune with how easy it was to make these live, but I know Triff has been screaming from the rooftops since the release how flexible Yummy cards are, so I guess I should have listened to him more. Happy to admit that. So yeah, why is Yummy Mitsu specifically in tandem together so impactful? Well, of course you have the synergy tying it all together of Herald the Arclight. Arclight has been an absolutely integral card since Yummy's release, but it has been in the past too. It's phenomenal in many matchups. It provides you one of the very few Omni Negates that exist in the format. It has that Floodgate effect as well, and it's incredibly easy to summon. But you also have this extra sort of buff, being able to search Ritual card and goes to grave. This is how the Yummy will access Mitsurugi, and great. Now, how does this fix Yummy's problems? Well, it makes it a bit better into breakers, because Dark Ruler, Dark Hole, Regeki can all be problems. And where Mitsurugi helps with that is they give you disruption in the spell and trap card zone. So obviously Surprise already existed, but now beyond Surprise, you can also revive with prayers to nuke Mirakumo. You can rip a card from their hand Mirakumo, which can matter a lot in some positions. And then depending on how heavily invested you are into Yummy, you have Purification for negate. Now I think specifically you need to play either a large Mitsu engine to facilitate Purification and take advantage of that aspect of the deck. It fixes the problem Yummy has, or you need to play a very small Mitsu engine for a different reason. I'll explain that problem. That problem of not being able to destroy cards, gone. Now, anytime you get to play in main phase 2 with Yummy, or even if you're going for a kill shot, and say you don't have access to the field spell, you make Arclight, throw it away, Habakiri, Ritual into Mirakumo, nuke field. Why that matters is if your entire intent for playing the Mitsurugi cards is for that interaction point, then you just play the tiny Mitsurugi package. I think those two distinctions are important, and even though they are the same deck, they actually function pretty differently, and the deck list will look pretty different as a result, but they have differing weaknesses and strengths. The Dark Ruler one specifically matters because you can't revive off prayers when you get Dark Ruler because you can't take damage. And without Purification to stop that, it could be a little bit dicey. The fact that the Mitsurugi cards line up so conveniently with the Yummy cards and fix the sort of problems that exist is the reason this deck has taken over. This feels like a very strong deck that is the center of everyone's attention in the moment. However, I do think that with it being in the spotlight and it being a driving force in the metagame, cards and text shift around it. And what that means is cards like Droll that weren't as important before now are seeing play in main decks pretty commonly. Moltres and Meowls as well. something that wouldn't have fathomed being in the main deck, is pretty good against this version specifically, because it really eliminates a lot of what you can do and forces you to end on very little. And with you having less non-engine, playing more engine cards like the Mitsus, it means your fields get worse. It's easier to kill through your half fields. I think this deck's engine is probably the best right now in terms of its strengths, but because it's not entirely like just outpacing everything and has weaknesses, I do think that it doesn't become a tier 0 threat. It's sitting at a slightly above position to the other tier 1 threats, just, yeah. And the next Yummy deck I want to talk about is Yummy Solfachord. So if you haven't been paying attention over the last few weeks, Solfachord has skyrocketed in popularity as a new way to play Yummy. What it does is it provides an incredibly easy way to put multiple level 1s on the field. Obviously that means Link Freebo and then synchros into cards like Cupsy Way, Lollipo, and Cookie, whatever you need to see fit, as well as it can provide you extension going second, with Solfachord Happiness often being called another version of Obedience School, but without any of the locks. It means you can provide a huge number of cards in play to do a lot of crazy stuff with. And that includes going into the Solfachord links and setting up IP, which can bolster your end field. The Solfachord Link 3 can also just negate Dark Hole and Regeki type cards, not Dark Ruler, so that's still a weakness, but you also get an extra negate from the Solfega in the Pendulum Zone, which wouldn't be affected by Dark Ruler. To me, this deck fits alongside a similar tier as the pure Yummy deck, as tier 1.1. Now, what are the key distinctions here to talk about? So what the Solfachord cards add is some consistency, but mainly extension through disruption, and this matters most for mid-range decks like Mitsurugi and Draco Tale when you're going second, and pure Yummy decks as well, that don't have these uber insane end fields. The Happiness and Primoa normal summons can just generate enough bodies that guarantee you access to these level 2 synchros and the Snatchy, which are the cards that let you run away with the game. But it does come with new issues. For one, you are reopened up more to weaknesses to cards like Perulia and Fualos, which were not as bad in the pure version, as well as Droll still hurts you significantly, just like with the Mitsu cards. My other big problem with this, however, is an additional problem that isn't the same with Mitsu cards. You have less bricks. That feels great. But what doesn't exist there is when you draw just Solfa cards, and if you're forced to play a pure Solfachord game, it doesn't always line up the best. If you go for the main Solfachord line that protects your Cupsy synchro from negation, it plays into Nib. Don't love that. But if you do just straight up Cupsy synchro to play around Nib, you play into Ash, Imperm, Purge, and you're forced to now play pure Solfachord unless you've already drawn Yummy cards. I find all these things, even though they can happen Mitsu cards, I'd much rather end up playing pure Mitsu than pure Solfachord. The cards are just stronger than the other weakness that exists within these Solfachord cards, and so they don't provide you with more removal going second. So that means is, again, the same as with the Mitsu cards, if you can't clear bodies off the field, the Solfas don't help in that regard, which I think is actually a problem that Yummy can have in some game states, especially if you're able to force your opponent into the battle phase and deal with their minion. Those are all the Yummy decks I'm going to talk about for now, but there are other ways to play Yummy. For example, even with the Mitsu Yummy deck, right, is it the standard one? Is it Solfa Mitsu Yummy together 60, which you can do with the Viner even, because the Solfas are fairies? Is it the Nouvelle Mitsu Yummy deck, the Triff Blade? Is it Fiendsmith Yummy? Fiendsmith Solfa Yummy? Fiendsmith Solfa Yummy Mitsu? Solfa Yummy Mitsu? Is it... There's so many options. Even Primite's one, because Primite's, again, is a one-card Cupsy synchro. You can really just do whatever the hell you want with these cards. But now let's backtrack a bit and talk about the Mitsurugi cards. Mitsurugi was a breakout star at the beginning of last format as a pure deck. It did very well in Europe, and it did fine in other regions as well. The deck has problems with the Droll, which the Yummy cards can help with. You just lose Impulse, and you may lose some flexibility in your extra deck with cards like Super Poly and such. Mitsu does provide a pretty powerful end field though, being able to set up from floodgates. Even though you lose Falsadina, you can still make drag Luxion, the rank 8, to search 7 Tachyon and then floodgate your opponent out with a different water statue or berry statue like the water statue or some other nonsense I'm not thinking of probably. And then you can back this up with cards like Harbinger and the Mitsurugi Purification, guaranteeing you floodgates to go alongside your Cancer. Awesome. I love Yugioh. The problem with this deck though is if you don't go that route, your end field can feel a little weak. Some people will argue they are still FTKs, but I think that the disruptions can be picked apart a little too easily. And once that's done, As long as you can deal with the follow-up the deck kind of gathers, then it's really not a problem. So these are all things that make me not rate it too highly right now. Now, beyond pure Mitsurugi, there are a couple other ways to play it. Mitsurugi Orcust is another popular one that I have always kind of hated. I never really understood people's fascination with these cards. I've never been a big Orcust fan. For me, Orcust feels like it has significant amounts of bricks and dead cards at almost any given time. It feels like it can still be weakened to cards like Fuwalos that pretty much end your game almost instantaneously. And I just don't have how it plays into removal either when you go second. You also don't have the ability to make Feral Imps anymore in this deck. Orcust, for me, though, can still do very well when it goes first. If anything you've seen in Mass Duel, it's the end field is kind of nasty. Cards like Babel and Langursu, the Revive for Ding, Crescendo, and its immense follow-up, I'll make it rather hard to cope with when you go second, especially if you do pair it alongside Mitsurugi cards. These are things I label it as an average strategy. I think pure Orcust is the same. I think they don't really fix each other's weaknesses or strengths too much. I think people's idea of them being complementary is a little off basis. And I think even if they can top and can do well, I don't see them really reaching the end goal of winning a major event. Another way to play Mitsurugi is with K9 cards. And this is one that Jeff Jones showed off in YCS Anaheim. And the idea behind it was you can search any ritual summon, ritual monster, like with K9 getting Infinitrack into the Megalith card, and then you can make Ashland. Ashland can then trade out the ritual for Habakiri, and voila. Of course, this is insulated from Ripper as well, so things like Nibiru, Valor aren't going to be a problem. However, there's other ways to do this too. For example, you could just say, screw it, I'm not searching the cards in engine. You'll just play both engines together and rely on both being strong to function, as well as the fact that sometimes you're able to just set up like early Rippers to beat Droll, being a leading factor in why something like this might work. And then Mitsurugi providing you extra extension when you go second, because the K9 cards aren't always great, although there isn't really too much synergy binding them together. Having played against this deck a fair bit, as one of my friends has played it, it feels like it's going first is incredibly powerful. K9 Noroi looking at your opponent's hand is insane. It's a big reason why that engine is another engine worth noting. As well as it generates 3 rank 5s worth of materials, which can be used for links like Saryuja, or for rank 5s like Ripper, or other links. And it also sets up the Izuna for more disruption in the opponent's turn. And even if a deck isn't triggering Izuna when it goes first, going second it almost always is, because they have some sort of graveyard effects. Yeah, I mean, I think that the K9 cards still are very strong. A lot of the problem is they can't push that well going second, and the Mitsurugi cards can do that. As well as any weakness to breakers like Dark Ruler are offset almost entirely when you have Purification and Prayers face down, and you're Saryujing into more non-engine that can protect you. Because of that, I think this deck is still a relevant and viable threat. It can maybe be near the average strategies, but I can see this deck doing very well. That kind of brings up the end of Mitsurugi decks that I had planned. It's weird how Yummy has felt like the more invasive engine than Mitsurugi at the moment. There will be other Mitsurugi decks as long as they remain untouched. Although I do think at this point their days are somewhat numbered, and a impactful ban list will level them a little bit more. Okay, the next engine to talk about before I break out into some other more concrete decks, and that is the K9 package. We've already talked about K9 Mitsurugi, but there are 2 other K9 decks that I think are pretty distinct and have very real places in the metagame. And that is K9 Crystron and K9 Vanquish Soul. K9 Vanquish Soul is actually a deck that I've lost to at the last 2 ICSs. This deck was obviously the best deck, literally a month and a half or 2 months ago, and has fallen from grace, with the ban list being the biggest reason for that. But where do we sit now with K9 VS? Well, me losing to it should kind of signal that the deck's power level really hasn't gone anywhere. If you look at the deck list and the restrictions, outside of Dice Smasher, there's no meaningful way this deck is worse outside of consistency hits. When this deck draws well, it'll still be incredibly powerful. Holly Sue is still one of the most powerful cards you'll ever read. You just may have less fires to make it all work. As well as less stake your souls means you have less starters in other ways too, where even if you stake your soul to summon Holly Sue from a deck or for a Mad Love, those aren't really viable either anymore. So this deck has to find other sort of ways to cope. The most common way it seems is to just play it standard and say the consistency will sort itself out with other maybe search cards like Road and Durendal or Small Worlds, but not leaning into anything outside the engine like a Sword Rival X Rival package for King Dempsey or the Dododo cards to accomplish the same thing. This deck's end board was powerful enough and resistant enough to breakers that it pretty much did not need to play the Mjolnir. So despite this being a K9 deck, this deck losing that doesn't feel like a big problem. This deck is still a relevant and viable threat and can easily win a YCS. The biggest problem with it and why it's not higher on this list as a tier 1 dominant force is because A, it's not popular, meaning that putting a lot of effort at least into preparing for it is a bit pointless. But also the consistency issues. There's not really good solutions to it without just putting worse cards in your deck. You kind of have to just try and get a bit luckier to win the tournament. And it definitely can work out because the deck is strong and it's not terribly inconsistent, but it's also not where you want it to be for a long 14-round tournament, and that definitely will show when you enter these long hauls. Next up is K9 Crystron, and I actually have this in the same position as well as a relevant, viable threat, not a tier 1 dominant force. This one is a little more popular, especially amongst some of the stronger players. Granted, I'm not sure if they're still playing it. I guess you can tell from Pittsburgh, but a lot of players were playing it in the events in the last month. This deck is was one of the few decks that can use the K9 package. It is more consistent than the VS version, as well as it has a lot less bricks than the Mitsu cards. Is able to flow more fluidly together, as the K9 cards do have direct synergies with the Crystron cards, with Solfachord and Fafnir, of course, being 5s. This deck's end field is decently strong, and you alleviate any weakness you have to board breakers by playing Mjolnir. But with Mjolnir gone, this deck now does have this sort of problem reappear, and that it's not terrible to breakers. Its end field is decent, but Dark Lord specifically and some other breakers, especially in tandem, like a multiple Dark Holes, can really put this deck off. It can summon Infinity, it can set up a way to summon Drags from the opponent's turn, as well as other K9 disruptions with the Cluster Pop and follow-up, but it's not mind-blowingly oppressive the same way a Yummy Mitsu with Purification at its disposal too is. My other problem with this deck that, I've kind of always had, and why I've never played it, is I feel like going second, it's not fantastic. When you're able to lead Jokel into like a strong card like Solfador, you can maybe generate enough resources to play through Disruption, but most of the time when you're trying to bridge together like your 1-card starters, they're not impactful enough into Disruption to really get you there, especially when most decks end on about the same number of disruptions as you have cards in hand. So just trading cards 1 for 1 isn't going to cut it. You need to be trading upwards with your cards, and other decks like Mitsurugi can do this a lot easier, but the K9 Christian cards neither do that well, besides sometimes Jokel. And for me, that's what holds this back from being a better deck in my opinion. Removal it can struggle with, has a limited number of pushes, sometimes negation struggles with, and the K9 and Christian cards, while they do have synergy, and more so than other K9 hybrids, it's not entirely fluid between the strategies. So yeah, K9 Crystron, this one is probably the most debatable placing I'll have. Well, let's put it at a relevant, viable threat, but not higher than that. Okay, those are all the main engines I want to talk about out of the way. That's a lot of the tier list. But these decks all intertwine together that it's kind of hard to discuss them individually, and I didn't really know how to approach it. So hopefully this was comprehensive enough and clear enough that you guys can form opinions, understand weaknesses and strengths of each of these strategies. I'm going to work myself from the bottom up now, so let's go through the decks that I think don't have a good position right now. So let's talk about some rogue decks. Labyrinth being one. It's cool that you can fletch your opponent out with Arius and then try and Genji to lock your opponent with powerful floods. One of those was Barrier though, and that is gone. As well as this deck just continues to be power crept out, but it feels like its engine, even when it's functioning on all cylinders, sometimes can still lose in an engine battle versus decks like Mitsurugi and Draco Tale. So the fact that you have all these different problems to worry about means that your engine becoming less and less viable. It means that the deck is falling further and further into rogue, unless something changes via new cards or a huge format paradigm shift. Not happening. So yeah, Labyrinth feels rogue to me. Next up is Fire King. This is a cool one that a bunch of people played, especially notable players like Dinkabui, at a YCS Lille. I think this should have been in that rogue slot even then. Obviously, much respect to those players, but I don't think this was a great call. My problem with this deck is, I guess it does exist within two versions, right? Fire King and Drac. But even within those, I feel like the deck's power level is not high enough. You're really relying on your non-engine to carry you. And I'm talking about how a lot of the best decks are pretty good into a lot of non-engine. And that means that the rest of non-engine aren't doing enough. So relying on cards like Impulse, Dominus Spiral, and such can feel sort of pointless. And it's also in the problem when your going first combo isn't like uber broken. I think this is where the Drac cards aim to patch that up, give you more ability to blow your opponent when you go second and drawing up the Giga combo, like the ALO, not the ALO, the Megalo plus Kirin, as well as make your turn 1 better by setting up that Astro combo. But I think it'll struggle to grind versus Mitsu and Draco Tale, as well as it's not enough power in either of those ways, or consistency wise even, to make it all come together in something I'm happy with. So I think this deck is just power crept, but I think now it's even more alarming. This deck is getting players to choose it. I love Fire King, it's fun, but I don't think it's a good choice. Next up, let's talk about some average strategies for next YCS. These are ones that I can easily see doing decent. For example, top 32, top 16, maybe not top 8, but maybe they're lucky. Probably not win though. Definitely not terrible by any means, and can easily win versus a deck higher than them. They just have flaws, or there are alternatives that do the same thing but better, that stop it from reaching these higher placements. The first of which is a Go Second Gem Knights. So right out of the way, the biggest problem with this deck for me is people making go first, which at a large scale tournament like a YCS will happen in later rounds when everyone knows what everyone's playing. So it means you're almost playing for top 32, which I hate. That being said, when you build it to go second, it can do so pretty effectively. And it means that you actually are able to win game 1 and 3 in a lot of matchups. And this is one deck that is affected very much by Mjolnir and Barrier being banned, because it means you can rely on an all-breaker strategy and get by. Now, that doesn't mean there's no decks that can just flood you out. One thing that I haven't mentioned, I guess, is the K9 Krishna deck has an ability to flood you out. Instead of getting Mjolnir, what they can do is they can search for Scrap Recycler, and then instead of sending one of the Krishna cards, they can send a Spell Canceller. Spell Canceller can then be revived with Quinkery, just not your opponent's field, you take it to yours. Still, but besides that, most of the time there really isn't much these decks can do to stop a tied together string of breakers that Gem Knight can do. And then Gem Knight's able to convert very few cards into a lot of bodies and a lot of damage very easily. Master Duel really gave me an impression for this deck that it's better than people think it is. It's just in a best of 3 format, eventually you'll be doomed, which is rough reality that I don't know how to solve. Next up in this tier, I have Memento. And this may include K9 variants. I didn't put them in together because I don't know how popular that is. But Memento can still put up some quite impressive fields. Of course, you can bridge into the K9s with just Mementos and Tats Tushi goes, if that's what you want to do. You generate so many bodies and so many different types, attributes, levels, that you can do a lot of weird and wonky stuff with it. But even besides that, just the Memento cards are very good at providing disruption and follow-up in a way that most decks really can't deal with. Almost like it's Mitsurugi. And when it sets up, it's hard to play against. And unlike Mitsurugi, it's pretty good into both Fuwa and Droll. His Fuwa's not huge for Mitsurugi, but still, it's good into both those things, which is impressive. Where this deck falters more, though, is the conventional hand traps sometimes can end your turn. Cards like Valor, Imperm, Impulse, Ash, depending on your hand, can beat you. Sometimes they do nothing, other times they end your turn. A little more fluky, though, than I'd like, in contrast to other decks. As well as going second, this deck can sometimes just collapse. Where it depends on the matchup, but in some matchups you just can't play going second. You have a lot of bricks in your deck, or cards that aren't complete bricks, but they're not very effective either, like Gaddock, sometimes even Sleepy, Mind Creation, Arm Dragon, Memento Titlan. They all come together to create what can be very awkward hands, or hands that just really can't fight into a high-powered metagame. For me, it's just an average strategy, but it's not bad. Next up on this list is White Forest. So I think it picks up that power level from Memento a little more to be even better going first, with a little more going second. But I still find this deck can struggle when it goes into removal-based disruption, which therefore makes going second a little bit harder. But new support has made it better at that, so it's not entirely lost. Where this deck can struggle, however, is versus both Droll and Fuwalos. It's nice this deck has lost Barrier, though, so it's one thing that's not going to be bogging you down as you try to climb at the field. Yes, this deck can play other Links and Synchros or Exceeds or whatever, but it can't use them to the degree that other decks can, meaning that Barrier freaking hurts you. You don't cope that it doesn't. That wraps up the decks I have as average strategies. Moving on, decks that are poorly positioned. So the poorly positioned decks are decks that have had success in recent YCSs. These have all placed within the top 32 or 64, depending on the event. But I think I would not bring them going forward. And first up, or first two, are going to be Primite variants. So Blue Eyes and the Odeon deck. These decks sort of thrived as, at the beginning of the last format, it felt like people were playing very high hand trap counts. And these decks would function very well into that. And when your opponent's engine was very minimal, the one drill beam was incredibly effective, especially when paired up with like one or two other negates. And then a decently resistant engine that could recycle itself well and wasn't fragile to any one card. Now, these decks have their bricky aspects with cards that don't do anything. The trap cards, the Majesty, the Blue Eyes itself, which can obviously be a problem. But I think the big reason that holds these back now is as we shift into a higher engine-based format, as non-engine really doesn't cope well enough anymore. The Solfachords, the Mitsurugi cards, in tandem with other engines, it means that you can be overwhelmed. And just relying on these grindy decks doesn't seem like it'll work out enough of the time that it's worth playing these. So yeah, I think these decks, because of how the meta has shifted to more combo heavy, they just can't cope anymore. Next up is Lunalight. So Lunalight is a bit of an interesting one that I've placed in the poorly positioned one. I think this deck has potential to be better than it's perceived, especially by me. But it feels like every single lingering floodgate that exists to counter combo decks hits this deck, right? So Droll, Fua, but then it also can struggle into the simple hand traps like Purge, Impulse, Imperm, Ash. And it just means that so often this deck just falls short. As well as the deck's high engine count means you don't get to play a full suite of these engine cards or non-engine cards yourself, which isn't the biggest problem, but this deck can't play into like a half Yummy field as well as some of these other decks because it's a little weakened to removal on initial plays. It's nice that you have this unbeatable monster in Liger Dancer that so many decks have no answer to. I just don't think it's enough to warrant this deck being better though. Next up, I got Sky Striker on this list. So Sky Striker, I do think, is a poorly positioned strategy right now. If you've played against Striker, you realize the by far best card in the deck is not Engage anymore. It's actually the new Lynx Zero or Engage Zero. Being able to search and then tribute to pop and summon 2 from the deck is insane. But when you're able to keep the deck off monsters, it can kind of feel a little fluky, or flimsy rather. What this means is when you're holding Ash, Bell, and the sorts for that effect to special and pop, the deck can kind of falter. To me, that's a problem. When Ash and Bell are relatively popular in the format, Bell's a side deck option for Draco Tale. Ash obviously is a main deck card. Impulse is popular in every Mitsurugi variant that doesn't play Yummy cards. It means there's so many cards that just destroy your Engage Zero. Droll is also a thing that stops you from playing a pure gas heavy version and forces you onto a mid-range version, which is also just has a problem of not being strong enough against combo decks. So it means that all this in mind, it doesn't line up well into format. The cards are very powerful though, so it wouldn't surprise me if this deck does rise up to preferential spots at some point. It just has enough weaknesses that I don't know if it'll ever be a tier 0 deck without new cards, as it's easy to prepare for, but also it needs a very specific type of metagame for it to thrive. Yeah, for now it'll stay in the poorly positioned category. And the last deck I have in this category is Ryziel. This one is poorly positioned because of Droll, obviously, but also because what the fuck are you doing with this? King of the Fairlands was banned, so obviously the Mitsurugi version of this deck is kind of just non-existent. This deck gains Barrier being banned, but in return has lost Ouroboros. So now your engine capabilities are severely diminished. You have to rely on just Detonator Cross to get there, which can be blocked by hand traps, obviously. A lot of these decks right now can play off of the field really good, specifically Mitsurugi and Draco Tale, and Branded, I guess, too. Removal was fantastic versus Malice in the decks. That format is not as good right now. It has restrictions on consistency, it has restrictions on end field, it's bad into Droll, it's not getting any favors from power creep. So I think all that said, Ryziel is being pushed into relegation, and we may see future formats where Ryziel is no longer something you can consider on a tier list. On that note, let's move up to the next tier. And we're back at relevant and viable threats, decks that I can see doing very well. They're just not the biggest threats to the format that shape the rest of the game around it. And speaking of Ryziel, one of the decks in this tier is Malice. So why does this deck thrive in a way that Ryziel hasn't? Well, okay, this deck didn't get hit in this last exchange. But this deck was being heavily targeted for so long as that driving force. So now that that has shifted from that perspective, Lancia not being the metagame helps this deck out, obviously. And obviously the Malice lengths are all still incredibly insane. You also have the fact that this deck can play Impulse, one of the strongest non-engine cards a lot of decks, or some decks, can't play. The problem with this deck, it's just weakened. Splash Mage and consistency hits all make it a little more fluky in terms of its capabilities, and you're forced to rely on this deck a little more as a 2-card combo deck in some instances, which can obviously mean you have to play less non-engine than what you could before, and overall bringing the deck a bit down in quality. One thing this deck can do very well though is play Bestials, as it can act as both engine as non-engine. So if we see big shifts in Bestials being favorable, then this deck can resurface even more so. But with how powerful this deck's engine is when it goes first, and the fact that it can be flexible non-engine and it can play Impulse, means I do think it warrants itself as a viable threat, and it wouldn't surprise me if this deck does well. The last deck I have in this tier is Branded, fresh off some new support with the Fallen and the Virtuous. This card doesn't actually provide a huge degree of support for this deck. I mean, this may be a hot take, but the card is fine. It's best used at breaking through fields and forcing negates like Herald of the Arclight, and of course being searchable means it is incredibly flexible. Well, it fixes the problem this deck used to have of not being able to interact with spells and traps like Floodgates, but I don't expect many non-fusion areas in this metagame, so that's not an immediate problem. Although other decks can use this too, to fix those same problems if it's a problem they have. What this deck gains more so is that Barrier is banned. You actually get to play a lot of games, and this deck does have decent abilities to break through a lot of fields, especially ones that only 1 or 2 negates, and that is most of Yu-Gi-Oh right now, because unlike Master cards like Appaloosa, that's banned now, and Master 2, but Baron and Savage, these cards don't exist for us, right? And it means that these spell-based breakers can be tied together to be powerful. Branded's end field has always been very good, very layered, very hard to deal with, as well as has good follow-up. So that hasn't changed. And that all makes Branded at least somewhat viable. It has weaknesses to essentially every floodgate, but also doesn't lose to any one of them. And that's important because it means that you have a lot more ability to actually play the game and agency in your decisions. And it makes that it makes it so that you're not just having non-games as often. And that way Branded is cool. I do worry though that it's just not powerful enough and it's still too much power creep to keep it from the absolute highest level of success. And the new support may fix that again in February, but for now it's just sitting here. What is interesting though is that even though there's only the one new card, this deck has seemed to become a lot more popular, even if just due to reprints and people's attention being brought back to it. And with the barrier ban all coming together, I think this deck is something you have to at least know how to play against, because I do think it'll be somewhat popular. All right, guys, I have one last deck on this entire tier list to talk about, and it's actually my favorite deck from the format, and I'm putting it in the tier 1.1 section, where it's a dominant force that does demand attention. That is Draco Tale. I've heard people call this the Draco Fails, and they really hate this deck. I don't get it, man. I think this deck is great. I think this deck has powerful one-card plays, and it gets better when you tie cards together. It has 5 mana, which is one of the best cards, like forever. And it does have a fair bit of flexibility in how you want to approach the deck, whether it be the branded cards with the dragons, with Cortesias, more pure. I've even talked about the Perform Pal version using Dissolver, Joker, Monkey Board. But this deck does a lot of things really well. It's one of the few decks that has non-targeting destruction for the back row, while setting a follow. But Urgla is just so crazy in that way, where it's one of the few things that lets you break a field, especially half fields, and feel really confident about it, even more so than say Mitsurugi did, and that's something that I really enjoy. This deck has fallen from limelight quite a bit. It's not at the top of the metagame where maybe it was at the start of the last format, and for that reason it doesn't demand the same level of respect and driving force that it used to, but it is powerful enough that you want to play cards like Double Cyclone, Droplet, Purge, Bell. You're already playing Ash probably, but Brutality, all these cards, if they're on the main deck, will be in the side deck because they are so effective against Draco Tale. As well, it is scary, where if you disrespect it, it can get away with wins. But Draco Tale also thrives that a lot of the best non-engine in the format, like Fuwa and Droll, are either terrible or not insane against this deck. That's one of my favorite things, is that if I get Fuwa'd, it does impact me, but it's not going to be this huge moment where I just lose. When I get Drolled, I almost just go. Okay. And of course, this deck does get a boost with the barrier being banned too. If this deck is the main focus of the format, it does become worse because there are a lot of cards that are good against it. Maybe not game ending, but they are impactful. Because even cards like Mourner and Veiler can be strong, even if they're not the entire being for the deck. It doesn't FDK it the way that a Fua can end some decks games. But okay, that wraps up this tier list, and hopefully that gives you guys a very comprehensive idea of how I feel about this format, with decks, strengths and weaknesses, where they kind of lie, how they interact with each other, how the non-engine metagame shapes around it. And I will have a more comprehensive non-engine tier list as well coming out soon, so keep an eye out for that. But for your next regionals, YCSs and all that, until a format shift occurs, this is what I'm looking at as being the big sort of picture for the game right now. Let me know if you guys disagree with anything, what you think, if I understated a point, overstated a point, missed something altogether. I'm happy to hear about all of it. With that said, I'll see you next time. Have a good one.